Okay, so the pressing question on everyone's mind is when ArcaOS, well, the second pressing question. The second pressing question is, when I get my ArcaOS 5.1, how do I get from what I have installed now to ArcaOS 5.1? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a few different upgrade scenarios that you may encounter and the best approach to take to get from point A to point B. Oops, I did it again. Oh. There we go. Okay. Again, we covered this earlier, the major release, minor release, and bug fix release. So what we're doing with upgrades is we're going from 5.0 to 5.1. Updates are minor changes, and that would just be when we get to 5.1.1. So right now, as we discussed earlier, 5.07 is the current 5.0 release. 5.1 we expect before the end of this year. That's when we expect it. It's really infrastructure that's holding us back. And when I say before the end of this year, it could be before the end of this month, or it could be sometime in early December. It's infrastructure. It's just a matter of getting all the pieces in place so we can distribute the software. Then we'll have a normal release cycle for 5.1, where we're going to have 5.1.1, 5.1.2, until we get to 5.2 at some point in the future. Right now, we haven't started conceptualizing 5.2, which is why I didn't talk about it in the roadmap session. We have some thoughts about 5.1.1, things that came up after we decided to freeze 5.1.0. So there will be some stuff that's coming in 5.1.1. Upgrade licensing. As I mentioned earlier, there will be a discount available if you've got an existing subscription for 5.0. You'll get a steep discount going to 5.1. If your subscription has expired, there's no discount. You'll have to buy 5.1 new. Or pay the bump to reinstate your 5.0 subscription and then get the discount to 5.1. But honestly, if you're going to be leaving 5.0, you might as well just buy a new 5.1 license. So here's our first upgrade scenario. So you've got a traditional BIOS system that's running any 5.0 release. So 5.0 that's never had any patches applied to it, or 5.0.7 that's got the latest ISO applied to it. You want to end up with 5.1 English on the same hardware. So this means that the machine is capable of obviously running in traditional BIOS mode. It's got a compatible CSM that provides enough functionality for what you're doing on ArcaOS. That doesn't mean that if DOS support is not working on that system now, installing 5.1 in traditional mode is not going to give you DOS support. But if you have no need for DOS or WinOS 2 support, and you like that machine, you want to keep that machine, you want to keep using that machine because it has a great 4:3 display on it that's got plenty of vertical space so you can read things and not just watch movies, which is what widescreen was invented to do anyway. And you want to keep that box. This will work out fine. You put in your 5.1 USB stick, start the install process, select update, upgrade, and let her rip. Yes, sir.
Is there any reason, like I never use DOS or Windows, is there any reason to keep them? I mean...
You don't have to.
Okay,
Now, once you've installed ArcaOS with DOS and Win3.1 support, removing DOS and Win3.1 support is not as simple as you may think it would be.
Uh-huh.
Installing fresh without DOS and Win3.1 support, you do end up with a few DOS files that get installed as part of the installation. Some of them may be necessary.
In order for it to run. even
In
though
order
not
for it
running
to, exactly,
DOS. Okay.
exactly. So for instance, if you deselect DOS and WinOS 2 support, you'll get some DOS statements in your config.sys files. Config.sys file, you'll get like files and buffers and I don't know, a couple other things. TCP/IP might give you the DOS TCP/IP files.
And
Yes.
Leave them?
And there's one other
Leave them. Yes.
Leave them, okay.
Yeah.
There's
What's-
one other thing. Even
Yes.
if you deselect DOS, some people can go, I deselected it. But when you deselect it, there is still a mini VDM that's created for the graphics stuff, even on the UEFI system.
Right.
If you go into top, you'll see that there's one VDM session. And when OS2 loads at its very early start, some of those VDDs, from what I understand, are loaded by default by the kernel.
Right.
To actually create that VDM. So some
Which is
people-
why you don't see statements for them in the config.sys file, but they're loaded automatically by the kernel. So
And is there much overhead? And like, say I just.
A tiny,
I just
tiny
loaded
bit.
DOS, but didn't use the Windows stuff?
it's a tiny bit.
It's
Yeah.
negligible. It's a few hundred kilobytes in RAM. That's it. Until you actually load.
That's the neat thing about VDDs is that VDDs don't really do anything by themselves. They just map things to other stuff.
Right, okay, thanks.
So that's scenario one, and you will end up, or you should end up, with a working ArcaOS 5.1 installation with all of your desktop intact and all of your applications as they were, and updated content that comes on the ISO.
Has this improved
Oops.
since a year or two ago, this upgrade thing?
Yes,
Because I once tried it, and that machine doesn't work anymore.
that's very interesting.
Wasn't the end of the world, but,
Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Yes, we have made a number of enhancements to the upgrade process since we implemented it. Many of those enhancements have been based on user feedback.
not mine, but.
Not yours, but feedback from others. I upgraded and my desktop icons got rearranged somewhere along the line. Well, that's not supposed to happen. So we had to go back and figure out why is the shuffler doing what it's doing and not preserving the settings as they were. We do a bunch of other neat things with the update and the upgrade bit. We turn off system sound, we turn off the screensaver, we turn off a bunch of stuff so that we get the upgrade done, and then we flip all that stuff back on again, assuming it was enabled before. Because the goal is, as I say, for the system to come out working as it did before with the new code from the ISO on it, but configured the way you had it working previously. And again, getting back to the DOS and WinOS 2 thing, when you do an upgrade or an update, you have no option to change your initial installation personality and custom selections if you did a custom install. So let's say you did a custom install and you selected Firefox Thunderbird and you didn't select SeaMonkey. And you put in a 5.1 stick. When you get to the update upgrade page of the installer, you select your target partition and you're going to get updated whatever was previously selected for installation before. SeaMonkey was not selected before. You have no option to select SeaMonkey to add it now. You'd have to install that manually after the fact.
And can you do that from the stick?
Yeah, you
I wonder-
theoretically could do it from the stick. It's not an automated process yet to install
Like
bundled
add a feature
applications.
You forgot to install.
Yeah, we don't have a facility for doing that yet. Don't give up on us though, because we may do something
Like
that.
one is the legacy Netscape browser, which a couple of programs installations use.
Yes, yes, and which is obviously why we bundle it with ArcaOS, because if you're using the feature installer, for instance, you need Netscape. So
But that's
you can do
also
it.
quite easy to install afterwards, because it's just on the disk in the directory search somewhere, you could just start installing it.
Well, you can run the as we always say, the venerable IBM installer for that, and it will. Yeah, doesn't Netscape use the IBM installer?
No, it's a separate thing that you run via SID, but it's not part of selective install. Netscape 4.6.1.
He uses the IBM install.
Yeah,
Netscape.
Netscape.
Oh, yeah.
Communicate.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now,
It does.
I mean, when you install it after the OS is installed.
If you install it after the OS is installed, you go to the Netscape directory and you run the install exe from there, and it runs the IBM installer, and then you can run the IBM installer from the Netscape folder on the desktop to uninstall it,
You mean
or
on
from
the,
a prompt
on the stick or on the install?
on the ISO.
Okay.
Right, so we talk about the stick. The stick contains the ISO. You still have to mount the ISO. We do have a facility for doing selective install for networking, which will automatically hunt down and mount the ISO. But we don't have a selective install utility for other things that you didn't select during
Does that
install.
assign a drive letter to it when it does that?
Yeah, it'll
So
assign
you
a
can do
drive.
that and then get to the
Yeah, sure. Or frankly, if you just browse to it in the regular drives object and double click on the ISO, assuming that you have the ISO drive installed, which we install by default with ArcaOS, it should mount it up and give you a drive letter.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, automatically.
Okay, a scenario. You've installed the old Netscape 4.6.1 and
Yes.
the original 5.0 install.
Yeah.
You've uninstalled it. Now you upgrade.
What's going to happen is you're going to get it again.
You're going to get it again. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, unless you go into the export file and tell the export file that no, you don't want it, and you change
Well,
it
you
to
could
0.
edit the export file.
Alex?
That's what you're doing.
Can you edit the export file? Yes.
Yeah, as long as you do it before the actual install.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's based on the export file. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I think that's where we isn't that where we read the software
That's logical.
selections?
I think
Or do we import from the export file to a?
like we don't use the original export file when we're doing an upgrade. We detect what's
No,
actually
you're right.
installed.
You're right.
Oh,
So
okay,
if
so
you
no.
have uninstalled it, we won't put
you
it
won't
back.
reinstall it. Okay.
You're right. You're right.
Okay. Good.
We had this conversation not too long ago. That's what I couldn't recall.
That's
Yeah.
what I was trying to ask you. Yeah.
By the way, would you suggest backing up that partition?
I would always suggest backing up the partition twice.
You can use DS.
Twice.
That bullet points.
In the store before you go on.
Yeah, right. So in scenario 2, you have a traditional BIOS system running any 5.0 release, and what you want is 5.1 in German or Spanish or Italian. Well, you can't upgrade. Upgrade doesn't work from English to non-English. So you need to back up your existing volumes, run the 5.1 installer, lay down a fresh install, and then copy your stuff back. That's pretty much the way it is. Likewise, what you'll see I'll get there. Hold on. And obviously, it may not be a matter of just copying your stuff back. You may need to reinstall some applications if they have installers that write to the INI files and what have you.
Oh, mentioning that,
Mhm.
have you ever, like, that's a big headache, like you set a system up, you have like 16 things on it, for some reason you have to set up a new install, you gotta reinstall all that stuff.
Yeah.
All you really need is some stuff in the INI files and stuff, right? I mean.
Well, there are utilities like Unimate, which will allow you to do portable backups and portable restores, and you can back up the settings for a particular application and then just push them back later on.
Okay, well, that's a good suggestion.
We don't support that directly because that's a third-party application, but there are applications that will allow you to do that. I've proposed that at some point we come out with a separate product that would be a program migrator
Right.
facility, so you could actually create
Great.
bundles of installed packages and move them. We've had to do this kind of stuff for enterprise clients where it's a custom application and no one knows where the original installation utilities went. So we've had to manually inventory all of those odd files that we don't recognize from anything else and then put them in some sort of packaging order and then move them over and extract them and
Right.
try to figure out backwards, where all the settings are supposed to go for them.
You know what that sounds like?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
No, but I have a déjà vu. Wise machine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. Wise machine.
Right.
Well, actually, one of the things that's kind of difficult. Well, one of the big problems that I've always had with migrating any OS2 application is that when you look at OS2 INI, there isn't a well-defined standard. So if you look in regedit 2 and you see some applications just have a random registry key name, or whatever you can call it, an INI entry, and it's not always clear which name belongs to which application. So that's what's always made desktop migrations from old systems difficult, is that there are manual processes. But if you, for example, have a registration key that you insert into post-road mailer, that's put somewhere in an INI file setting. How do you know which INI file matches with what application,
Right.
which icon step? So you've got the icon sets in the folder, that's easy to backpedal. But if you've got templates installed, how do you all stitch that together in a single backup package? That's always the...
It's tough. It's just that it's not an easy feat for us to switch one language to another or switch from traditional BIOS to UEFI or the other way around. So as we'll see in a moment. So here you go. Here's scenario 3. You've got new hardware. There's a CSM that's available, and it's got a single disk in it. Ensure that the CSM is enabled so that it's booting the way your old machine should have been booting. Test booting the installation media in traditional BIOS mode then. Copy the existing installation from the old drive to the new one. And then just do a regular upgrade. That should work just fine. Because essentially you're going from traditional mode, boot mode, legacy BIOS, to traditional again, and the same language. You're just using it on different
Pretty
boards.
neat. That's a nice migration scenario.
Yeah. Oops. That was that one. Right, so 5. So now you've got new hardware, the CSM is available, and you only have a GPT disk. And you've got other OSs installed which require GPT. So wiping the GPT to make it MBR isn't an option. Well, if you only have one disk and it's GPT, there's only one way to boot from it, UEFI. So in that case, enable the CSM if you can. Back up your data. Well, you don't need to back up your data because you're not going to ruin your other installation. That's an old machine. Do a regular installation in using UEFI, and then migrate your data over from the old machine to the new one. Either slave the old drive up to the new machine, because as I said before, you can work with a mix of GPT and MBR disks, and you can just copy it straight disk to disk, or back it up and restore it, or copy it across the LAN, however you want to get it there. But you need to do a full clean installation in order to get UEFI.
One thing is, what you're suggesting is you could take a booting partition on OS2,
Yes.
create a partition of the same size on the new machine,
Mhm.
copy everything over, and it should boot up, or not?
No, maybe not.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that if your old machine is traditional BIOS, which it would have to be if it's booting ArcaOS 5, your new machine also has a working CSM, so it could theoretically boot in traditional BIOS mode, but it has other operating systems on it, and the single disk inside it is configured GPT. The other operating systems are dependent upon it
Right.
being GPT. In order to boot from that GPT disk, you need to install ArcaOS in UEFI mode.
Okay.
We don't do a conversion from traditional to UEFI. So you do a clean install UEFI, and then you transfer your data over in some form or fashion from your old system to your new system.
Question, wouldn't enabling the CSM cause it to boot in standard mode instead of UEFI mode?
No, I didn't say boot in legacy mode. I just said enable CSM. You can enable the CSM and boot in UEFI mode. The CSM should provide.
Say UEFI plus CSM.
Yeah.
It says.
The idea is, and this is coming straight from David, that the CSM should provide a more robust traditional BIOS emulation for us, even when we're running with our UEFI loader.
Yeah, there's a way to say boot, prefer one or the other.
Yeah, it would be
Right.
enabled.
Yeah, but it all depends, it changes per system. Some systems you.
Yeah, it may not be available. You know, not all systems are Lenovo systems. Not all laptops are ThinkPads.
That's why it says if possible, it doesn't say you must.
Why not?
Oh, but-
Exactly. Exactly. So that's scenario number 5. Scenario number 6, you've got new hardware. You've got a CSM that's available, a single storage device that's GPT again, but you have no other OSs on the machine. So you have no real reason to keep GPT. So why keep it? Ensure the CSM is enabled and see if it boots in traditional BIOS mode. If it does boot in traditional BIOS mode, then reconfigure the disk for MBR using the init disk command line utility that comes with ArcaOS 5.1. So when you boot up into the installer, you go to the system management console, open a prompt, and run init disk. Select the disk that you want to change, and tell it which way you want to go. You want to go from GPT to MBR, and it will remove the GPT information from both copies on the disk and convert it to MBR for you. Reboot, and now you have a blank MBR disk. And then just install in traditional mode, MBR.
I mean, is there a reason to, like, why wouldn't you just leave a GPT installed? Or some
Well,
disadvantage?
okay, so UEFI is great, okay? It's terrific. ArcaOS is a traditional BIOS operating system. It runs best in a traditional BIOS. If the traditional BIOS is available to you and it does everything you need it to do, as in maybe it won't allow you to run DOS sessions, but you don't need DOS sessions for anything, then there's no reason to use UEFI, because UEFI isn't going to really do much for you other than allow you to run the boot ArcaOS under UEFI. I'll get to that in a minute, discussing reasons to use UEFI versus traditional mode. If the only reason that you would be installing UEFI is because you needed to reuse a GPT disk, but there's no reason to really keep the GPT disk, then don't. Convert the GPT disk to MBR, which will make it blank. partition it like you normally would, like you've been doing since 1980, and then install ArcaOS in traditional mode. Done. Problem solved. Okay, so scenario 7, you've got new hardware with the CSM that's available, and you need fully functional DOS and or WinOS 2. Well, now we're getting a little complicated because chances are the machine may boot in traditional BIOS mode, but not be able to open a DOS window or start WinOS 2. We know that our UEFI loader with the BVH EFI.sys base video handler will give you working DOS and WinOS 2. If you have a need for that, then you have a need for UEFI. So, enable the CSM if possible to give yourself a more complete BIOS emulation. And then boot in UEFI mode, do a clean install, and transfer your data from your old system to the new one. So that's one reason to definitely install in UEFI mode.
And the CSM becomes kind of a resource available to ArcaOS then? Is that what happens internally?
Yes, it provides BIOS, an emulation of some BIOS services.
And ArcaOS kind of checks that out to see if it's around? And if it is, it makes use of it?
I don't know that it actually checks it out. It expects those services to be available.
Uh-huh.
And under UEFI, without the CSM, those services would generally not be available.
And then it'll do whatever it needs to otherwise.
Right. The UEFI loader for ArcaOS provides much of that stuff. So the interrupt 13, the interrupt 10 support. But if you've got the availability of the CSM, you should turn it on.
What does this will be automatically determined mean?
Okay, I knew you were going to ask me that question. I didn't have an easier way of writing that. What it means is ArcaOS 5.1 is on hybrid media.
Yeah.
So if the machine is configured to boot in UEFI mode, it will boot that ISO, the USB stick, or the physical DVD as in the UEFI environment. If it's configured to boot in legacy mode, that same media will boot in legacy mode.
So here we're booting in UEFI, but we've enabled the CSM.
But we've enabled the CSM, right. As long as that machine is configured to boot in UEFI mode, it should boot from that ArcaOS installation media and automatically boot it into the UEFI environment.
Right.
Because if you're in UEFI mode and you try to boot something that only boots traditionally, it won't boot.
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed like, I'm at this point not sure which of the two, UEFI or GBT, but the booting stuff is better, it sounded like. Like the thing where it knows about the boot list, Arca, or whatever that's called, AirBoot doesn't work anymore.
AirBoot doesn't work under UEFI, and AirBoot doesn't recognize GPT.
Okay. So if you use, which one is it that provides that thing that we're talking about where it maintains a list of the boot?
The BIOS boot manager has entries in it and when we install in UEFI mode, we insert an entry into the BIOS boot menu that says ArcaOS.
And that sounded better to me than dealing with, I mean, can be a headache with AirBoot and whatever else.
Boot managers can always be a headache, no matter which boot manager you use.
Yeah.
But then let's say you've got 15 different operating systems on that GPT disk. We'll migrate those into the AN launcher. So the BIOS boot menu will point to the Arca Noae launcher. That will start, and then you select which operating system you want from there.
Oh, okay.
So, reasons to use GPT. You've got other OSs installed on the GPT device, and you don't want to, or you can't, erase the GPT device and repartition it as MBR. Or, let's say you have a greater than 2 terabyte physical device, and you want to use all of it. You can create multiple up to 2 terabyte partitions for ArcaOS on that huge device. Otherwise, you could create 1 2 terabyte MBR partition or 25 partitions, but ArcaOS will only see a 2 terabyte drive instead of a 6 terabyte drive. So if you want to take advantage of all of that media in some form or fashion, use GPT. Oops, I went the wrong way. Oh, my finger keeps sliding off the little bump in the thing, the braille. Reasons not to use GPT. GPT requires the use of a filter driver. Filter drivers are, by their very nature, slow. Slow meaning they introduce some latency to the system, because every read or write request needs to go through the filter. Now, how big of a performance hit is that? You know, with today's solid state drives, I don't know. I haven't measured it.
I've done a crude measurement. It's approximately between 10 and 20% loss. In fact, some speed tests with Sysbench showed on one benchmark that it even outperformed MBR by a couple of 50 megabytes a second. So it's.
I would be very skeptical of a result like that.
Well, get the other data.
But that's, I mean, the performance is the main reason. And of course, if you want to boot from the device, you have to use GPT. So if you want to install in traditional BIOS mode, you can't use GPT for your boot device. You can use it for data volumes, 1 or more data volumes, but you need to have another device that you can partition NBR in order to boot ArcaOS. And as we discovered, some system utilities may not function as expected going through the filter driver, because the filter driver just changes the appearance of the media to what we need it to be. We need to emulate a physical disk out of a partition. And utilities that are looking to find a physical device are going to get stopped. I mean, they'll either present the partition as a physical disk, which would be ideal, or they'll get completely baffled by the fact that when they go to the hardware says, I have an 8 terabyte disk installed. And it knows that it's running on a 2 terabyte single disk partition, but it's a single disk and it's 8 terabytes, but it's a single disk and it's 2 terabytes, and so it'll get confused.
It actually seems that Sysbench gets confused by the empty slots. That's what's causing it.
That might very well
That
be
seems
the.
to be it, because it seems to be choking on that. But
That's the way the filter driver works. It creates slots for those. I don't want to use the term virtualized disks, but that's essentially what they are. Those partitions are virtualized disks. So it creates empty slots for disks partitions that have not yet been created. And those empty slots, like those dummy USB devices that you have, confuse things.
Did you trace through and find the cause, or are you just going by?
I still need to run a trace and see why it is exactly.
Okay.
I'll probably ask Steve to look at it one day and see if we can figure
Okay.
it out.
Steve sent me instructions, but I haven't had time to do
And
it.
make an updated version of Sysbench that fixes it, because the benchmark results are probably still valid, because normally if you do it on an MBR system, it just grabs a partition and starts writing to it.
Yeah. If
So
it
that-
doesn't trap, I think it does. It's probably right.
Yeah, if it doesn't trap. Reasons to use UEFI. Well, if you don't have a working CSM available, you don't have a lot of choice. because you have nothing to even fake the appearance of a BIOS to ArcaOS. You've got to put it in UEFI mode. If you have other OSs present which require UEFI, switching back and forth between UEFI and traditional BIOS is a pain in the neck. And, as I say, if you need DOS and or WinOS 2 session support, you most likely are going to need UEFI in order to do that on modern systems. Reasons not to use UEFI. There is some boot overhead and complexity because you've got to boot the UEFI kernel, which runs in 64-bit mode in the UEFI environment, and then chain loads the ArcaOS 32-bit loader from the ArcaOS partition. And there's a lot that goes on to make that happen. You can avoid that overhead by just booting ArcaOS natively.
That said, once the OS is booted, most of that stuff is gone.
Most of that stuff is gone, yes. But there is a handoff, as we know, between the UEFI services and the operating system. And many things can happen in that handoff. You don't have that. That's not a consideration when you're booting in traditional BIOS mode.
There it happens as well.
That happens between the BIOS handing off to the operating system.
It's the same system.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's an argument to be made. If you have a working CSM that's available in the system, and the system boots and performs the way you need it to boot and perform, and you don't need DOS or WinOS 2, why complicate your life? If you have no other OSs installed that require UEFI, why make things more difficult than they have to be? So if you have Windows 7 installed on your machine is UEFI capable, and Windows 7 is booting in traditional BIOS mode, installing ArcaOS in UEFI mode is going to make Windows 7 require you to change back to traditional BIOS mode in order to boot it. So why would you do that? Just to show how cool you are that you can run ArcaOS under UEFI. And if you don't have a need to boot from a GPT device, you can boot from an MBR device. And by the way, you can install UEFI on an MBR disk. We don't really care whether the disk is GPT or MBR. UEFI will boot from either one. That's not a big deal. It's traditional BIOS that can only boot from MBR. But honestly, if you don't need to boot from a GPT device and you don't have any other reason to run UEFI, don't. Just boot in traditional mode. And the system will be fine.
Linux.
Yeah.
If you're using GPT, that's the right term, where it has the ESM, that thing, ESP.
The ESP, okay. The ESP, the EFI system partition, is present on any disk that is booting a UEFI system. Doesn't matter whether it's MBR, an MBR disk, or a GPT disk.
Oh.
Those are disk partitioning styles, not boot environments.
And if you're using UEFI, is there no longer that MBR thing where the disk loads initially off that thing?
There's no MBR, there's no master boot record in GPT.
Because Linux, it likes to overwrite that thing and put itself in control. And, is that avoided by using UEFI?
Well, if you install Linux in UEFI mode,
Uh-huh.
It will install its boot manager, Grub, in the ESP,
Okay.
the EFI system partition. And then the BIOS boot menu will point to that boot manager on the ESP to start. So you would, if you press the F12 menu
Uh-huh.
during post, and you select grub 2 from blah, 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 or maybe it just says grub 2, that will boot grub 2 from the ESP in the system. And then on that grub 2 menu, you would boot by default into Linux, most likely,
Right.
but your other operating systems would be listed below it. When you install ArcaOS, we insert Arca Noae launcher, AN launcher, and that boot menu gets modified to say AN launcher. And so that would point to the AN launcher executable in the ESP, which then boots up and allows you to choose from that menu which operating system to boot.
And do both things then appear? Or is it one or the
I mean,
other?
instead of,
All right, so wait a second.
Say you put in Linux.
Roderick disagrees with me now.
No, I don't disagree.
Oh, okay.
But I smell the question 1,000 miles away. His question is, where does grub go to? That's
Well,
kind
that's
of
part, yeah, that's part of the question.
What happens when there's another thing that happens in the background. There are in the UEFI system, there's a bit of storage space with a whole bunch of data, like the certs that I explained yesterday. Those are stored in NVRAM. And in the system, there's a list internally that tells the system which AV loader it's going to load first.
That's what I'm, okay.
And that's what you're...
That's the BIOS boot menu.
Okay.
Right, those are BIOS variables. They're stored in the system BIOS.
Like when you hit F12 on the Lenovo.
So if you install ArcaOS on any disk, whether it's GPT or MBR, and ArcaOS inserts that entry into the BIOS boot menu, and you pull the hard disk out, and you press F12 on the next boot, it's still going to say Arca Noae Launcher on that menu. Of course, you're not going to be able to get to Arca Noae Launcher because you pulled the disk out and you're holding it in your hand. But that entry will stay. That's separate and apart from the AN launcher install that's in the ESP on the disk you just pulled out. What that BIOS does is it points to the AN launcher executable on the ESP, and that's a UEFI executable. UEFI is a mini operating system unto itself. It's a 64-bit operating system. So when people say, is there going to be a 64-bit OS2? Well, this is it. This is as 64-bit as we get. So the BIOS is going to point to the AN launcher executable on the ESP. It will start AN launcher, and from the AN launcher menu, you will by default have you'll have your ArcaOS 5.1 installed on whatever disk it is. You select that, or you let it time out, and it will just go there and boot ArcaOS. And your other recognized operating systems will be migrated to that menu as well. So we'll have those in there for you to select. Yes?
And I recently made a discovery that kind of was also a bit clarifying for myself. These boot menus vary from system to system, but I've now had 2 or 3 laptops. I can see it here. I first installed Windows 10 on this laptop, and here in the boot menu, you've got the first entry, and it still maintained Windows Boot Manager. And that's the second boot position. After that, I installed ArcaOS, and that was added to it. So what is the big difference with your problem with Linux coming in on an MBR system and pushing that to the side on these 2 laptops?
It's confusing, believe me.
Yeah, it's a little clearer now.
I got a question. So-
Good.
So what happens if you're messing around with BIOS and you accidentally delete the entry? How do you recreate it?
We have tools on the ArcaOS ISO. So the best way to do that is to stick your ArcaOS stick back in the machine, boot from the stick, go to System Management, and there's a tool there that you can use called, is that EFI VAR? Is that
I think actually if you go into Mini LVM, you can actually just click.
Oh, you can do it from Mini LVM.
AN launcher, add AN launcher, and it should
Okay,
be
cool.
added.
Yeah,
Because
and
I've
then
done
it
that
will.
once like 10 years ago. It was either Linux
Yeah,
or
that
Windows,
would-
and
that
the
would be
string you have to
installed
type in
in
or remember is so obscure.
Yes,
I was
yes,
like,
yes.
I'll never do this. I couldn't.
Oh,
So that's why I started going to NVR and doing regular
Yep,
boot after that.
yep.
Because
I think it might.
Yeah.
be-
that was a headache.
I think it
Indeed.
migrates it then again.
It was like I broke it.
I don't know.
What OSs does it know about?
What OSs does what know about? Arca Noae
Your
launcher?
booter thing, Our booter.
It recognizes several flavors of Linux and Windows, ArcaOS, obviously.
VMware,
I
would it
also
recognize
think
that?
It may recognize a VMware partition, particularly if it's GUID and VMware has its own GUID. That's the neat thing about GUIDs is that, unlike MBR partition types, so for instance, type 7 is an installable file system, NTFS, HPFS, JFS, right? A GUID, which is that whole string of numbers, points to may point to a specific partition used for a specific purpose. So although the ESP is really just a FAT or FAT32, FAT16 or FAT32 partition, it has a specific GUID. So you can always recognize if that partition has that GUID on it, that's an ESP. That's what it's supposed to be. Now under MBR, it's a little more difficult to determine what's an ESP and what's just another FAT partition. We do a fairly good job of making that determination. Because obviously we have to, if there's an ESP in the system, we have to find it because we want to use that for our stuff as well.
Right.
Yes, sir.
just a note of caution. If you install ArcaOS in your unified mode, a lot of people these days want to have a dual boot with another operating system. Don't use NBR then, because Windows, for example, if you boot that in UEFI mode, it will only accept GPT. So if you install ArcaOS in UEFI mode on an NBR disk, you have that option. But if you want to dual boot that, then you boot into Windows.
There's a caveat to what you're saying. It depends upon the version of Windows.
No.
If you have Windows 7 on the machine,
I'm talking about UEFI boot.
UEFI boot.
If you boot a system in UEFI mode, the Windows installer will, starting from Windows 8 and higher, which supports UEFI boot officially, it will only accept the GPT disk.
Didn't I say in
I
my...
don't think it said that on there. If it did, I didn't. I don't-
Really?
I don't, maybe it did, I don't remember that part.
I thought that out very... reasons to use GPT. Other OS is installed on a GPT device.
Or if you're going to install.
He's saying you don't have Windows installed on it yet. If you want to install it later, but you have Arca installed within.
Okay, so let me be clear.
That's what he's saying.
Other OSs currently present or planned to be present on a GPT disk or dependent upon GPT, then you would use GPT for ArcaOS. And Windows installations after Windows 7 are persnickety about install. If you're going to install it clean, it's going to want GPT. Now, if you upgrade a Windows 7 to a Windows 8, you don't have to convert it to GPT. I don't know if 10. I think that 10 forces you to convert when you upgrade from 7.
No, it's only
Really?
when you boot in UEFI mode that Windows I tried every trick in the book and
Does Windows? All right, hold on. When you boot in UEFI mode, you boot in UEFI mode.
It'll only boot to a GPT disk or Windows.
Windows will only boot. When you boot in UEFI mode, Windows will only boot from GPT.
you can only install to a GPT. If you try to install to an NBR disk, you just say not.
Windows, yes. Linux, no.
Some distros, it depends on the distro.
I guess it depends on the distro, but
That's the confusing thing.
I'm a SUSE guy, so
Yeah.
you know.
Me too.
I also don't know how
Well, here from the vest.
I don't know how Linux disk, if you can, I never tested a Linux distro with UEFI boot and with a ESP on a Linux and on an NBR disk, and then you can dual boot Linux and ArcaOS next to each other. I never tried that combo, if that works.
The machine I just set up for Diane has exactly that setup. Linux and ArcaOS on it.
Okay.
And when OpenSUSE installed, it installed Grub2, made a BIOS variable entry for Grub2 in the BIOS boot manager. And when you go to Grub2, it does not recognize the ArcaOS partition
Right,
because it's not aware of our GUID. Our GUID for the ArcaOS Type 1 partition is published. So if you go to Wikipedia and you look up GUID partition table, you will find in the list of GUID partition tables ArcaOS Type 1 and our GUID that we made public. So everyone should be able to recognize, assuming people keep up with updating the tables that they use. Because the specification only says that if you're going to proclaim a GUID, you proclaim a GUID somewhere publicly. So I went to Wikipedia because I couldn't figure out anything more public than that. Twitter. But right now there is only one type of ArcaOS partition. It's the ArcaOS Type 1 partition. And that has one GUID. And of course, GUIDs are, by their nature, supposed to be unique. That doesn't mean that someone else didn't come up with a GUID for something else that he installed 10 years ago and has been using that for his ext4 partition for something. But it's not a recognized GUID for anything else at this point. Other questions about when to use GPT, when to use UEFI, upgrading from one to the
I have
other?
a slightly related question,
Sure.
which is when you're shopping for SSDs, recently I wanted to get another one because of the situation here.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's, like the Samsungs I always buy, so there's Evo, Cuvo, Pro. Is there a reason, like, is there really that much difference between those things? Maybe you don't know. But
Performance, caching. Are we running?
I don't think so. I think it's just,
The
you know,
QVO
random
drives
people
are a
texting
quad
me, probably
layer
about the
instead of
election.
triple
Okay.
layer like most of the others. The quad layer, the
Yep.
write speed is significantly slower. So in order to make up for it, there's a larger SLC RAM cache, which is single layer. And some of them use DRAM for the RAM cache. That'll be around 8 gigs usually on the Samsungs. So that means the first 8 gigs that you write into the drive will be as fast as the more expensive drives. Anything beyond that, it'll slow down to
interesting.
about hard drive, regular mechanical hard drive speed. But that means that after you're done writing to it, you have to have the computer on long enough for it to flush the data to it, and if you don't, it'll just continue flushing into it next time you turn it on. Because it'll still be in that DRAM.
Can you write an FAQ entry for the Arca Noae website that was 30 seconds of pretty good info from
Yeah, I wasn't taking notes, and I'm the guy who writes most of the facts, so
Yeah,
I'll.
I'm into a lot of the technical stuff.
The short answer is get the Pro.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, if you
I
don't
mean,
want to
they're quite
look
a
up
bit
and
more
wonder why and
expensive,
what's
so.
going on and which ones, you know, the details about the hardware, why one's faster than just get the Pro.
Yeah, I did read once a little bit about it.
But usually just get the Evos, because usually the ones that say Pro, that just, nowadays, they're just signifying that it's PCIe 4 speed.
Uh-huh.
The Samsungs that say the Pro.
But the Evos are okay?
Yeah, the Evos use TLC, that's triple layer.
Cuvo, no go?
I wouldn't. I mean, I've got a
Okay.
couple of them, but I've also seen how slow they go when you run out of that 8 gigs of cache that's on there.
Okay.
And I've seen it go down to like 10 megabytes a second write speed. The random write speed, you look online, everyone says it too. After you get beyond that, they're slower than mechanical drives.
I mean, I got an Evo, so.
So if you're not doing
Yeah,
humongous writes, like Steam games that are 100 gigs big, you're not doing stuff like I'm doing, then you would never know. You think it's just as fast.
But to be honest, how quickly would you reach with your average OS2 usage that 8 gigabyte
It
buffer?
probably wouldn't matter that much, but it still has a lot lower write expediency.
I typically stick with the Evos myself. I happen to be partial
That's what I
to
get to.
Yeah, I happen to be partial to the Samsung drives for whatever reason. I honestly don't even know why, but I happen to know most of the models at this point, so I just sort of go with
Plus
what I
they
know.
come with that software that makes it easy to copy.
That's the one problem is that Samsung Magician only runs under Windows.
Right, and
And-
it only copies Windows partitions, I found also. It didn't just ignore the other ones.
Exactly. And be careful when you use any of those SSD utilities. don't trim your ArcaOS partitions.
Oh.
Okay?
Really?
Because our JFS driver doesn't understand trimming.
Oh.
And there's no communication to the file system driver when you've trimmed the drive.
What does that mean, reduce it in size?
You want to explain trimming?
I don't know an easy way to explain it. I mean, it's junk collection is what most people describe it.
Yeah, it's garbage collection essentially, but it does. Jan, do you want to explain trimming?
I mean,
Well,
it's-
basically, it
kinda like
reorganizes
formatting.
the internal SSD mapping from sectors to actual memory locations in the SSD. And if you do that, it's to maintain efficiency and stuff like
Mhm.
that. But if you do that, the file system has to be aware.
The file system driver has to be aware that the
Yeah.
data has been relocated.
Yeah.
It's kinda like
Windows and
defragging
Linux
to-
support that,
to
but
easy.
ArcaOS doesn't.
ArcaOS does not support
It's
it.
like a reorg, sort of.
Yeah, I mean you can think of it almost like when you used to
think of it like
defrag the disk.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But the difference here, and you wouldn't want to have Windows try to defrag a JFS volume for you.
No?
No good can come from that. Trust me. No good can come from that. So avoid that part of it. When Samsung Magician says optimize disk, no, leave it alone. Please just leave it alone. And don't think that if you just point to your NTFS partition that it will only optimize your NTFS partition, because that's not the way trim works.
Yeah.
Trim looks at the data across the whole disk and chops it up, whatever file system is there. So you need to have a file system driver that's trim aware. We have a ticket open to enhance JFS to allow for trimming. Enhance JFS. So if you have any HPFS volumes, they will never be enhanced to support trimming. Never. It's just not going to happen. We don't have access to the HPFS source files. I think there are probably HPFS files in the DDK. Nope, not even the DDK.
It's dry. It's a dead.
So that's not an issue. And we'll never have HPFS 386 for ArcaOS.
Right.
Because HPFS 386 belongs to that company, the name of which I forget now, but it's located in Redmond, Washington. And when we were negotiating our licensing arrangement with IBM, they said, now do you want the server or the client? Because the server's a lot more money. You know why the server's a lot more money? Because Warp server comes with HPFS 386, and that other company located out there in Redmond gets a chunk of every OS2 server license ever sold at any point in time. So we said, no, we'll do without HPFS 386. We're fine with JFS for our larger than 64 gigabyte
And
volumes.
they allowed you to license the client but get the SMP kernel?
Yes, that was a special deal that I had to work because the SMP option was server only.
Right.
So I had to make the point and make it understood that I knew that at the time the only systems that had multiple processors in them were servers. But now every system has multiple processors in it. And no one wants to buy an operating system that can only run one processor. So we got a custom SKU for that. And the restriction that we can only sell the SMP kernel with an ArcaOS license, which includes the OS2 license. So we can't sell SMP by itself as an option, which was fine for us anyway. I mean, it wasn't,
When you put a ticket in for JFS, is that you guys fix that?
Yeah, JFS we fixed.
Yeah.
David maintains JFS. Yeah.
Were you thinking that IBM still fixes something?
No, just,
No, IBM won't close the door.
by the way, the other day when I was putting Ubuntu on, one of the partitioning file systems was JFS.
Yes, well remember the Linux JFS driver,
Pardon?
the Linux JFS driver has a common root with our JFS driver, but the two code paths have diverged considerably.
Oh my
Can
gosh,
they
they're
read
probably
each
trimmed.
other's data?
Theirs does trim now. Yeah.
Aha.
Can they read each other's data?
Generally,
Yes.
yes.
Generally?
Yeah, you should be able to read it.
You might not
Remember,
write to it,
You can write to it also. Remember that there are differences between OS2 and Linux. So on Linux, on a JFS volume, you can create 2 files with the same name in different case.
Right.
OS2 is case retentive but not case sensitive. So 2 files that have the same name on a common JFS volume, you're only going to see one of those files on OS2.
Like on Windows, we have a LAN between Linux and Windows, and people on Linux create upper and lowercase, and then you can't get
Same
one
problem.
of the files.
Same problem. It's the same problem when you're again, that is exactly the same problem that we see with Samba shares of Linux files, where the case is different but the
Yeah.
file name is the same, and in a Samba client you only see one file because OS2 has no mechanism for presenting you, this is my long file name .txt, uppercase and lowercase, in the same directory. There's no way to do it. So you got to see one of them. Now, which one? I have no idea.
Shouldn't case sensitivity be made illegal?
Case sensitivity should be made illegal, yes, by executive fiat.
Yeah, I hate it.
Yeah, it poses a lot of problems. But assuming that is not an issue, you should be able to read and write to a Linux JFS volume from ArcaOS, and Linux should be able to write to that ArcaOS JFS
So
volume.
you could create a partition as your home partition and make it JFS, and then it would be accessible from
Sure,
OS2.
sure.
That's
One good use for that is if you want to share your Mozilla application directories, your user profiles between operating systems. Now, of course, you're probably, not that I would ever really suggest this except in an extreme circumstance, but if you have Windows, Linux, and ArcaOS on there, I would put that on a FAT32 volume.
Right, because then you could get to it from all 3.
Yeah, I'm not crazy about FAT32. We support FAT32 in ArcaOS much better than it's been supported before on OS2.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
And it works very well, and our extreme gratitude to Greg for his hard work on the FAT32 driver. But it's not a file system that is as robust as JFS, and doesn't perform like JFS. I mean, that's just FAT32. It doesn't perform like JFS.
On Windows, is it called FAT32 also? Or there's like an EXFAT?
EXFAT is a different FAT
Okay.
that is essentially a proprietary Microsoft file system. We try to get a license for that.
Oh,
It's another cash cow from patent devil Microsoft. They just have another bunch
Yeah.
of patents on it.
Microsoft is very happy to give licenses for that for device manufacturers. So if we manufactured a digital camera and we wanted to be able to use really large memory drives, they would grant us a license for that so that then the user could take that memory card and jam it into a Windows machine.
Maybe sometimes these laptops have slots with it, so maybe you could get away with that. No?
no, because you're not hardware. I could do it.
No, because yeah, exactly, because we're not selling the hardware. Lenovo could do that, but that doesn't give OS2 a license to make a driver for it.
Right.
They won't sell hardware. If you don't sell it, then
And there's a whole thing about open sourcing the EXFAT driver because they had granted was it Toshiba or Samsung? They had granted a license for the driver, and then someone at Samsung had posted the source publicly,
Nice.
and then it made a big mess, and the EFF came out and said it's not really open source software because there's no license with it. And then all of a sudden someone posted a license to it. Oh, it's open source now. Look, I just added a license. And then Microsoft tried to I don't know, between the two companies, I guess they tried to smooth things over and said, well, yes, you can use it, you can freely use it if you're using it for this, that, and the other thing. Not one of those was if you have your own operating system that's not Windows and you want to access an exFAT volume. So
So Linux doesn't support it, does it?
Linux does support it, yeah.
Now, how did that happen? Somebody
Those sources that went out, that's how it happened.
and they weren't bothered by that?
There is the open invasion network that protects Linux from lawsuits.
Because it's not sold, is that right?
Well, I don't know, that opens,
I believe using it in Linux was one of the this that.
yeah, exactly. One of the conditions of being able to use that driver's code publicly was that it was available for use under the Linux operating system, which means that it's excluded from use by everyone else, including
That
ArcaOS.
source is out there and you could get access.
Yeah,
to it.
sure, absolutely,
And
absolutely.
You could port your own, if you know how to do it.
Look, if someone enterprising wanted to create, say, a NetDrive plugin for exFAT, that could readily be done. I'm not going to say easily done. I don't write file system drivers, so I'm not about to claim what's easy and what's not easy. I mean, Greg has an idea. But
And practically speaking, if a private individual would do that and post that plugin somewhere, probably nobody would care.
that's true. That's true.
If a company would do it, it would be another case.
It's exactly the same thing as we have with the MP3 codec. Supposedly all the patents are expired now, and MP3 is free for everyone to use. But there's nothing definitive that says everyone is free to use MP3 and distribute an MP3 codec. So we still do not distribute an MP3 codec with ArcaOS. We give you directions as to how to go get it. You can get it from Hobbs and download it. That was one of the links I had to fix. Because we had a new ArcaOS user who said, the link to download the MP3 codec is broken. And I thought, I know who broke it.
But that's why you have webmasters that update.
Thank you. Thank you. I knew it would come back to me somehow.
Yeah.
So, but it's that very same reason. It's downloadable from Hobbs. Hobbs never had a problem with publishing the MP3 codec there. No one ever went after them and said, oh, you're not allowed to distribute that because that's copyrighted work. But we're a commercial enterprise, and as such, I need to be more careful with
Right,
stuff.
Roderick, when you were working on Ecom Station, didn't you accidentally screw it up for everyone?
Oh, you have to remind, okay, I'll tell the story.
Screw up all of Ecom Station for everybody, did you say?
I remember this. I actually blew the lid on MP3 licensing because I actually made the toxic phone call to the people in the US, because what I found interesting, this was circa 2005, when there was still a website called mp3licensing.com, and Menzies was selling these boxes of SUSE and Red Hat, and we were getting these huge boxes in, and they were selling by the truckload, and it had stickers on it, or it said somewhere in the menu, MP3 support included. And hey, that's interesting. How did these turkeys arrange that? So I sent an email to mp3licensing.com. I said, I have an operating system. We have an open source MP3 decoder, and I'd like to include it out of the box. Said, that's not possible. So time a couple of emails back and forth. And I still remember this toxic phone call, and I kind of blew the Linux community up unintentionally by that. So I called them back up, and I said, well, SUSE and Red Hat include the MP3 decoder. And I still remember this sentence from as of today. The woman on the other side of the phone said, SUSE, Red Hat, what is that? A month later, on a couple of other websites, a message popped up. that they had revoked MP3 support because probably now MP3licensing.com went after their asses for including an MP3 decoder. I was just trying to figure out what they had arranged with these, because I'd read between the lines on some other websites that they were not going after open source products. But it was ambiguously worded. Never was it the intention to press the button and blow the whole MP3. So a half a year later, the first boxes of SUSE came in, and it said MP3 support excluded, and where you could download was a sticker on the box. Sorry.
You rat out the.
Sorry. But I still remember that phone call from the nice lady I had on the phone. He said, Susie, Red Hat, what is that? I thought, you do MP3 licensing, and that was circa 2005, 2008, and you don't know what Linux is?
You know, it's amazing, depending upon what department in even a technological company with which you have to interface, the people may not have any idea. I mean, at IBM, for our stuff, I talk to people in the legal department. Well, what the heck do they know about code? We need permission to modify this, that, and the other thing. All they can tell me is if anyone else wrote that code and needs to be included in the conversation. They don't know what the code is, what's involved, and what we need to do,
Look,
where to find the code.
It's now years ago. It never fell under an NDA, as best I can tell. So I can have a laugh about IBM. It's 20 years ago. But IBM Netherlands didn't know what it was selling when Menzies got its own OEM contract with IBM, because we stepped up to them and said, you know, we want to license OS2 Warp with the latest code and Warp Server, so Warp Server free business. And they put up an OEM contract, and they both, and in the initial contract, IBM Europe sold us OS2 LAN. I'll not disclose the price, that's confidential, but accidentally they licensed LAN server and OS2 Warp for the same price.
I'm not going to comment on that.
And then when we had the same and then about a week later, there was this panicking manager on the phone that was like, because this is going to cost us a fortune for every license that we're going to sell.
One of the problems with OS2 development, and remember, when OS2 was developed, there was no open source, and software development contracts between companies weren't complicated like they are now. IBM used essentially a mainframe model with a lot of the development of OS2, and they got a subcontractor to do this part, a subcontractor to do that part, without giving a lot of thought to 20 years down the road, who's going to lay claim to that code just because there's a copyright notice in that code, and then want royalties for that code later on. They assume, well, as long as we market this, then they'll get a piece. And of course, I guess they didn't think that anyone would come to them 20 years after the fact and say, we would like to license your code and wrap our own operating system around it and sell it that way. And there's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of people involved that no one back in the day ever foresaw happening. So when I first approached IBM, it was sort of like a big question mark for them as to, this guy wants to license OS2? Who knows what OS2 is? And getting to the right people at IBM was terrific. But then I had to go through IBM Legal. And Legal had to clear a whole bunch of stuff, and that just took a tremendous amount of time before they would actually get to the point of being able to quote us licenses.
I once went to a Rex LA meeting, and it was wonderful to have some inside gossip from IBM.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is, everybody's always been wondering, well, why did ObjectRex for OS2 never became open source? Well, I heard that there for the first time. It was also a small legal detail. Turned out that ObjectRex for OS2 sources supposedly contained some code that they had licensed from Amiga, and they were not certain about it, and that's where you see the whole problem. Everybody that worked on OS2 all of the paperwork that's somewhere stashed in the basement. All the people that work and have active
That's the
recollection,
problem.
they all retired, dead, or worked in another company all these years later. So when you then ring the doorbell and say, IBM, I'd like to have this, they go like, well, you know, and then they'll probably think like, if we put a lawyer team on this, it's gonna cost X, is it worth the money?
Yeah, yeah. That's pretty much it. That's, you know, I don't fault them, and frankly,
It's a logical decision, you know, if they need to spend hundreds of hours trying to figure
exactly,
out.
exactly.
And as a giant corporate company, you don't want to end up in a liability situation because of potential intellectual
Exactly,
infringement.
exactly.
But have you read the jointly development agreement between IBM and Microsoft?
I have not read it.
Yeah, that agreement is public because it was evidence.
It was evidence
Right.
in the trial. Yeah.
Trial. And the only limitation that has there is that any of the parts cannot distribute any of the source code for 10 years. That's the
Yeah,
only.
but that doesn't address the issue of copyrights from other companies. I mean, there's
Yeah.
code from goodness knows how many companies
Yeah.
do this too.
Yeah.
Like Adobe has code in there.
Yep.
Yeah, but that is the limitation between IBM and Microsoft, and both has like some ownership of the source code.
Yeah, but the problem is,
But the problem is that IBM will
some,
not find
someone,
the source code.
if you want to get that done, then somebody needs to sit down at IBM at a desk,
Yeah,
take the
that-
source code and start looking, that's from there, that's from there.
The issue is
and
that
you
nobody
quickly
will
start
find the
doing it.
source code, nobody knows where
No,
it
that's the
is.
funny part.
Yeah, I mean,
Exactly,
I
yeah.
do not doubt it would cost IBM millions of dollars legally to go to audit the OS2 source code and clear it.
Yeah.
And if some, I mean, if, I don't know, Warren Buffett decided he wanted to open source OS2 and was willing to pay every cost, IBM might say, well.
Elon Musk,
Yeah.
right? Talk to him.
Well, I can tell you this, that Arca Noae's funding did not come from Warren Buffett nor Elon Musk.
Excellent.
That I can tell you without breaking any non-disclosure agreements.
Hey, if I win the Powerball today, I'll pay you the money so you can get it. Because I won't even notice the money then.
I mean, does IBM still have the source code for OS2?
I'd be astonished if they didn't
Yeah.
somewhere. Like they're.
It's in a drawer somewhere. They're going to raise
Like a
the
non-floppy
building,
disk that went-
and in the rubble, someone is going to pull out a bent and damaged file drawer and say, "What's this code?" And that's where we're going to find the source code for
On
OS.
floppies.
It's on flop.
It's on floppies, right?
Or printed out and it's truncated.
That's right, exactly. Could be printed out. It's printed out on tractor feed paper, and part of the characters are in the holes where the tractor
The whole,
feeds are.
yeah.
Is that a T? Is that a? What is that? So anyway, this was. Is everyone sort of
less
have an idea?
Yeah.
Good. Good.
Returning to that EXFAT though, isn't there a driver on NetLabs?
A driver on NetLabs for EXFAT?
Isn't the
Yeah,
FAT32
the
driver on
Valerie
NetLabs
from
actually?
Russia.
Yeah.
Did some changes to FAT32 to
Okay.
support exFAT. I haven't tested either, so.
It's where our FAT32 driver came from.
Yeah.
It's his development, and he had.
Right. He had.
but
He
it's
had.
not
But I don't know that
EXFAT.
the EXFAT really works on that.
Right.
Okay. So we don't know if it works, but it's the, I don't know if it's on NetLabs or his.
It's on
It's on
NetLabs.
It's on NetLabs.
Remember, we forked our FAT32
Yeah.
from NetLabs, but we specifically removed VFAT and EXFAT from the
Okay.
FAT32 driver.
If you incidentally need
Hopefully I
to
got
copy
one.
one file, you can use the DFC
Fingers
browser
crossed.
because that understands EXFAT as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. But you know, it's,
Are you part of the Open Invention Network?
Sorry?
Are you part of the Open Invention Network?
Not really.
You should, because it will protect you just in case.
Well, you know what the big difference is? I get the impression that in European Union,
Yeah.
it is much more difficult to start a patent lawsuit,
Ah,
patent law,
okay.
infringement lawsuit than it is in the US.
Oh,
Mhm.
we just need
Yeah.
interface to
That's why the
see with the
brain
whole
wants to
OS,
be
that way the
open
regular
source
browser
property
can access all
located
file
in
systems.
the Netherlands.
Yeah.
I see a lot of that.
Oh, you know something? I just thought of another ArcaOS 5.1 feature that everyone. Well, I don't know how many people will discover this.
I'm laughing
But
my pencil.
OS2 by default has a 2 gigabyte removable media limit. In other words, if you put in a large floppy device, if it's greater than 2 gigabytes, OS2 has no idea what to do with it. That's fixed in ArcaOS 5.1. So someone gives you, or you have, a 32 gigabyte FAT32 large floppy USB stick. So there's no partition on it, but there's just a 32 gigabyte file system on it. ArcaOS 5.1 can mount that and read it. With no problem.
5.0 can't.
5.0 can't.
Ah.
That's a very low level patch that we did.
And if it's partitioned, you can?
Oh, if it's partitioned, it needs to have LVM on it. If it's not partitioned, it doesn't have
That's
LVM on it.
when it comes up as a large floppy?
Large floppy. Yep. Yep.
Not large enough.
No, exactly. I mean, I guess at the time, our best guess is that we had 2.88 megabyte floppies at the time, and IBM didn't think that anyone would have a floppy device that would be more than 2 gigabytes. I mean, frankly, 2 gigabytes was rather forward-looking in 1990.
LS120s.
LS120s were 120 megabytes.
That's huge.
And LS240s were 240 megabytes.
Those even existed.
Yep. In fact, when I was at the developer conference in Dresden, Germany in 2005, I gave Daniela an LS240 drive because I was having issues with her driver, which worked fine with the 120. It was giving me some issues with the 240. So I said, here, have one. And I just gave her my drive. But that was the super disk to end all super disks.
Yeah.
240 megabytes.
Wow.
Then there was SideQuest. They had 1.2 terabyte. Sorry, 1.2 gigabyte.
1.2 gigabyte.
I think I also have other ones, like the Jet, I think were 1 gigabyte.
And it was a floppy. It was a floppy. It was
No,
no partition. No partition.
Large floppy.
Large. There was a large floppy. Wow.
That was not floppy, that was a hard disk.
Okay.
So if it's, remember, for ArcaOS, if it's partitioned, LVM needs to grab it, so it's got to have an LVM. It's got to have LVM data. The DLAT needs to get initialized for ArcaOS to read it, or use DFC and copy your files from.
can you put the LVM stuff onto one that's already got data, or is it? Like
You can use DFC to do that, and it will just initialize the DLAT sector. The DLAT sector should not be used for anything else. It should be available. The operative word being should, which is why I'm very careful when clients give me sticks that have their data on it, and I don't like to just initialize the DLAT sector because how do I know what Microsoft is going to do next week? You know,
So,
next
Jan,
thing you
that's what
know.
happened on my machine, was that got overwritten? That thing with Linux where it
Well, it
clobbered?
wasn't overwritten, but they moved the extended boot record to a different position, and then LVM gets confused because it thinks that its info will be 62 sectors beyond that.
Oh, right.
That's not the case anymore.
In theory, you can just fire up an LVM or mini LVM and assign a drive letter to the partition, and it'll add the DLAT.
And that will initialize the DLAT right there. Right,
Yeah, but
put it right
if,
back.
if the thing was created on Linux, there's a chance that the LVM info will end up inside the Linux data.
Yes, I remember that.
Oops.
So that OS2 will be fine, but you'll have damaged something.
Yeah.
But unpartitioned media, large floppy media, doesn't get LVM on it. There's no DLAT sector. I mean, the space exists, but it's not reserved for DLAT because there's no partition data. It's funny when you start thinking about these things. And
Why is it sometimes USB sticks you like seem to not be able to partition them or anything? What's going on there? You ever have that happen?
What
Like I put it in Windows and it doesn't allow you to do anything to it. You can't repartition it, you can't do anything to it.
Well,
I've had this. You need to wipe this.
a damaged USB stick will revert to read-only mode and you can't write to it at all.
Oh, maybe that's what's going on.
That happens. The manufacturers have that in as a safeguard. So if the thing fails a self-test when you shove it into the drive and it powers up, it will lock itself in read-only mode. Then you can't reformat it, you can't check it, you can't do anything. You can read what you can read and that's it. And there's no way to reverse that short of mailing it back to the manufacturer. And then what they will do is they'll, if it's under warranty, they'll mail you a replacement that's blank. Thank you so much. Because as we know, it's not the data that's on the stick that's important, it's the stick that's important. Right. Yeah. Right.
Is there a size limit on memory sticks we can deal with now?
Is there a size limit?
2 terabytes.
2 terabytes.
Oh, okay.
2 terabyte large floppy. Now that's my idea of a floppy disk.
And if it went at that speed, how long would that take to write?
Oh.
Yeah, you don't even want to think about that.
Until the warranty runs out.
Yeah.
Yeah, weren't those LS120s, in my recollection, were really slow?
Yeah.
LS120s?
I have one. I have
Reading
one.
and writing LS120 media or reading and writing standard floppy media?
No, LS120s.
LS120s, yes, were slow. But I found because I still have an LS120 in my docking station.
Wow.
And reading and writing 144 floppies is much faster than a standard floppy drive.
Looking up on YouTube, I saw a guy recently that had the same question in the back of his mind and actually started to do benchmarks. And it turns out that writing to a regular floppy drive, one of those LS drives, is approximately 8 times quicker.
Yeah.
Anyway, there are more of those retro computers that are digging out all of this stuff from boxes and are putting it in PCs and starting to wonder, is a 1.4 megabyte floppy in LS120 drive quicker than a regular floppy drive?
The other neat thing about LS120 drives is you can actually software eject it and it will pop the media out.
Yeah.
I
You don't
just
need
seem
to-
recall it was it took annoyingly longer to insert and eject a floppy from an LS120 drive than it did from a regular drive.
It can, yeah.
Well, a regular drive is just a mechanical eject. It's like
Yeah.
Right. The LS120 caches the thing, so it's got to flush the cache before it
And,
ejects.
yeah. And I seem to recall putting one in, you had to wait sometimes a second before you could read even the regular
Yep,
floppy.
yep. And it makes some funny noises while it's going, you know, you get,
Grinding coffee.
well, exactly, exactly. But the real advantage of LS120s over zip drives, no click of death problem.
Well, I think that killed the entire Iomega brand.
Yeah, it really did. It was not the click of death that killed them, it was their handling of the click of death problem. Their lack of acceptance of it as a manufacturing defect and their lack of willingness to extend people's warranties to cover that problem.
It's like the Pinto or the...
And Steve Gibson really made a lot of noise about the LS120, about the zip drive click of death. And that all came together to come back to the company.
The zip that guy wrote up.
What's that?
Zip them right up.
Yep, exactly. But you know, it all comes back down to the same thing. A company is only as good as its after the sale service. So people buy ArcaOS from us, they don't just walk away with the license, they walk away with the license and the support behind that license. And I'm not just saying this because I didn't just shift into sales mode. That's not what I'm doing, because I know that I'm preaching to the choir here. I don't need to do that. But the fact of the matter is, we really are passionate about ArcaOS being the best OS2 on the planet ever. And we work hard every day to make it better than it was yesterday. So when someone opens a ticket for us, we really do take it seriously. No matter how frustrated we may get. Honest to God, no matter how frustrated we may get.
What would be really helpful is on your website if you had it, like, I struggled for 3 days here to compile a 3-line C++ program with GCC and link it. Like,
We have a programmer's information page in the wiki. I'm going to look at expanding that to be more inclusive and perhaps provide some how-to stuff.
So like, if you want to use GCC, you need to install these 27.
And if you have questions, go to OS2 World. Everybody that has experience there is around, like Paul Smith and Dave Dio.
And everybody who doesn't have experience is around there too, and always willing to tell you how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But no, a more definitive and easy to remember and get to place, which is great.
Just think of the presentation.
Yeah, well, that too.
Had you included everything that it said to install, you wouldn't have had the problem.
I understand, but you're looking for a monkey wrench solution that you can turn and let it run. But
No, just a list of what I need to install. There was some unbelievable thing I had to install. I would have had no idea that I needed it.
Listen, this happens,
You mean the sealant?
porting Linux applications, this happens all the time.
Uh-huh.
So I'll work on porting something, and I'll find that in order to build package X, I can start the build process, and the build process fails. Why does the build process fail? Build process fails because it requires a library from package Y. So I go looking in the RPM repository for package Y. We don't have it. So that means I have to go get the source and build package Y. Now I build package Y. Hopefully I can get package Y to compile without package Y complaining that it needs package Z. I get package Y to compile. I go back to package X. Package X, during the compilation process, finds that library from package Y and goes a little bit farther and then stops. Then I have to figure out, all right, why did you stop now? Well, it needs something else. I went through this, I had to build new TLS, GNU TLS, which is an alternate SSL implementation other than OpenSSL for something. Now we have a new TLS. The sun's getting in my eyes anyway, so I'll just move over here.
Something else that gets me.
Now we have a new TLS package at the NetLabs repository, but at the time we didn't. And I needed one, so I had to build it so I could get something else to build that was dependent on having a new TLS library. And you know something? The same thing happens on Linux. The only difference is on Linux, most of those ancillary packages have already been built. That's the only difference. We have a leg up because in the NetLabs repository, a lot of those libraries already do exist. But you're bound to run into, I don't know, 1,000 packages that don't exist yet, or that haven't been updated
Right.
and need to be rebuilt.
Now, like in this case, the thing that was needed was libc. And when you install GCC, I guess the missing thing might have been
Well, if libc wasn't there, then you just need the libc devel package.
I now know that, but I stupidly thought, oh, it says it's missing an EMX program, so gee, there's EMX, I should install that. And once I did that, you couldn't install libc. So
Okay, so here's a brief primer on that stuff, a very brief primer. If you're building using a libc-based GCC, it's not an EMX-based GCC, which would be really old. EMX libraries don't do you any good. You need to have libraries that are built with GCC. If you're building something and it says can't find libc, that means you need to have the libc headers or libraries available for development. So that's always going to be a whatever it is -devel package. So you immediately go back to the repository and look, I need libc devel. If you need debug info because you're debugging something, you're going to look for a package that either says whatever it is -debug or whatever it is -debug info. Debug info is going to have HLL debug data, and debug is going to have non-HLL debug data.
right. In
The
this
difference
case-
is HLL debug data is good for GCC porting.
I mean, in this case, I wrote like a 4-line C++ program, and I made a 3-line CMake thing to try to test it.
Okay.
And what it complained about was it was missing some EMX thing. So none of, what you just said, none of that happened to me. It was,
So
Yeah.
you complained about not having an EMX. Did it
Right.
say can't find EMX blah blah blah?
EMX, OMF, LD.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't see how he could start out without
Yeah,
libc.
exactly.
How would he get anywhere if he didn't have libc?
Well, he could start without libc devel.
yeah, but he said libc was
Not to
missing.
comply, you can't.
But it
Not
turns out,
practically.
it turns out libc apparently.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult because everything is dependent upon libc.
Yeah, you couldn't compile.
That's the whole.
without-
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
So that's why I wonder why they built the package so that if you downloaded the compiler, it just automatically pulls it in.
Yeah, it should.
It should. I mean, I know that the answer to that is going to be because on Linux, it doesn't automatically pull that as a dependent package. When we build RPMs, the RPM packaging process itself makes some auto determinations as to what libraries are needed. But when it comes to devel packages, those automatic determinations aren't made because you don't need the devel packages to run the binary.
But when you pull in Qt5 development packages,
Yes.
it pulls in a bunch of devel packages, but not the clib devel package, which it absolutely needs.
That's a bug. And my overarching point is when it comes to packaging devel packages,
Yeah.
you need to manually specify in the
Spec.
in a spec file this, and this. I've had that discussion with Sylvan from time to time about various things.
Yeah.
About documentation packages, for instance. When I install this, that, and the other thing, I don't get any docs with it. Well, you didn't select the doc package. Well, wouldn't it be nice if it grabbed the doc package? Well, maybe you don't want the doc package. I thought, okay, maybe I don't want to know how to use what I'm downloading. There's always that. We get tickets from people all the time who don't want to know how to use the software they have. They would rather open a ticket.
Yeah, we have a few of those.
And that's the reason why things like NVIDIA drivers are so huge.
Exactly.
Because they support everything because there's less of a support headache.
Exactly.
And then the other thing that happened to me was I wanted to install Python 3.
Mm-hmm.
This rat's nest happened with Python 2 and Python and somewhere at I686 somewhere, and then it wouldn't allow you to do it because it depended on something that was too old, or I didn't really even totally understand it. So I actually can't install Python 3.
Python, after all of that, you couldn't get Python 3 to install?
No, because if I tried to uninstall and reinstall the things I think I understood it required, Yum and APNM use them, and you can't do that.
Okay.
Like, how do you work around that?
All right, so from the command, you can't do it from ANPM.
Okay.
From the command line, you need to use the replace package Yum plugin. And you need to do a Yum replace of the version that you've got with the Pentium 4 version.
We tried to do that yesterday. You
Yeah.
can actually do it in ANPM. We support that now. I added that like last year. You have to right click on the package and choose install other versions.
Yeah.
Is that in the
That's-
last, David's running the last release version of
I have the most
ANPM.
recent 5.0.
But I walked him through doing it, so I know the options there.
Okay.
But that didn't
we
help.
did it and it failed, remember?
Did it actually fail?
You left because you had to do something else, but yeah,
Oh,
you couldn't do it.
We need to look at that. Let's look at that tonight when we're doing
Okay, I'll bring
our
the laptop down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's look at that tonight.
Good topic for the
Tonight we
help
have
desk.
the help desk session where you're going to be looking at.
I'm going to be the help desk. Wonderful. I love being the help desk. Who's working tickets today? And I look at all of the new tickets that have been posted to the bug tracker, and I think, well, it doesn't look like anyone else is working tickets today. So I guess
Does Yum use Python?
I'm the one.
It does. But because it's a command line utility, you can kind of change it underneath it and it'll be okay.
Because it's a command line utility, Yum is an executable itself.
Right. But you said it uses Python.
it does.
It shells out and runs it
Yeah.
or something, or?
I'm not sure how it does it, but it's probably, because there are two different versions of Python. There's Python 2 and there's Python 3.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, it may cache it somehow or create a temporary copy.
I mean, there may be a DLL that provides Python execution. I don't know really,
It's magic.
but also.
Yum itself is, in many respects, kind of a black box, unfortunately. I mean, it's open source, but it's this massive application that's written in kind of Python spaghetti code. I mean, have you ever tried reading poorly documented application-sized Python code? It's very difficult because there's no data types to declare. So you see a function that's gets something is being passed to it. You have no idea what it is.
It's almost as bad as Java. It's almost as bad as Java.
At least Java's a declarative language.
Yeah.
Python isn't. So there may
True.
not be anywhere that declares what this thing
PHP,
is.
how's that?
I mean,
It
Python-
compares to PHP.
Python makes Perl makes Python look fantastic.
Oh, Perl.
Oh yeah.
Perl is,
Oh my God.
The write-only language.
Yeah. Python's not so bad.
The thing is, if
If you
Perl
want
will,
to write it.
Python itself is a nice language. It's the abuse of Python that becomes a problem.
yeah, Perl is a wonderful language. Perl can do anything.
I'll take your word for it.
The trick to Perl, and I'm quoting Ilya, Perl can do anything. The point of Perl is making it do anything in as few lines as possible. There's nothing more elegant than a Perl one-liner.
The kind you can tattoo on your arm.
Yeah, exactly. Or after you spend a week coming up with this Perl script, it's this, that, and the other, and then you go to pearlmonks.org and you look up something and you figure, I'm going to brag about what I just did. Then you find some guy wrote a one-liner that does it in about 8 verbs. It's like, why didn't I think of that?
Using only symbols.
It's just unbelievable.
And then you discover that you have to fix a problem in it 6 months later, and you're looking at your code and it's just, what is this?
So anyway, I'll bring it down tonight.
Good. Do we have anything else to announcements? Tomorrow morning we are upstairs in the boardroom on the second
good point.
floor. The boardroom on the second floor.
Yeah, so tomorrow morning
Tomorrow.
in the boardroom.
Yeah, don't leave stuff in here.
We have half a day
Oh,
sessions.
yeah, we have to take everything, right?
We have to take everything tonight out of here.
Yeah.
So we still have a help desk in here. by the way.
Help desk is in here, so we don't need to take anything out until after that.
Yeah.
There is still some food left over from lunch in that one tray back there.
Okay.
If anyone would like some of the sandwiches, there's Cubanos and beef. No Cubanos left. It's beef and chicken that are left in the tray. Please help yourselves. You can have some.
Do they need dinner plans?
Dinner plans. We didn't have any specific dinner plans for tonight. I was thinking that we might order pizza and have it delivered. We could certainly do that. Just again, as always, I need to get a head count before we think about ordering pizza.
Yeah. This time it might be accurate.
It might be. It might be. But yeah, and of course I'm not sure from where we're going to order the pizza yet, so we need to figure that out. Did you say anything, Joe? Okay.
Thinking, but not yet.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I guess that's it. We don't have any more announcements for today.
Not that I know of. Anyway. Thank you. Quite a presentation.
That was a delayed response to my
You kind of went
presentation.
pizza maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Just sort of like
You went a little
morphed.
You went a little over.
It's still going on. I mean, there's still on.
That's true. I'm still taking questions.
Yeah.
That was like one of those trouble tickets that morph into this whole other thing. Oh, and by the way, this doesn't work either. And
Yeah, no questions. What's your favorite pizza flavor?
Oh.
I realized that I didn't ask you for artwork on the media packs.
You didn't ask me, but I know that you need it, and I
Yeah.
have to get it to you.
Okay.
So, although you didn't ask me, I was aware that
Okay.
you needed it.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things that's on my list.
Yeah, it's
If
not-
you
not
don't
pressing.
hear from me later in the week,
Come and take a
Okay.
walk.